D. Lamar Jensen had a fascinating aviation career, from flying Curtiss P-40s, being a flight engineer on the B-29, flying crop dusters in the good old days, and even flying in the Guatemalan Air Force. For the first time ever, he will revisit stories from his logbook during this rare interview.
We had been in the Air Force a year before we started flying. We had ground school, and we had basic training, and then we went to classification. And that was kind of scary because it wasn't until then that you really found out what you were going to do, what you were going to be. And the only thing I wanted to be was a pilot. But they were choosing pilots, navigators, and bombardiers. We went to a big auditorium, took a seat, and then as your name was called, you went up to the front, and there was a staff of 3 or 4 officers there, and you'd salute them and give your name and serial number, and that's all. You didn't talk too much. And they handed you your assignment. And so then you took that, you didn't read it yet, went back to your seat. And all this time I was just, just tight as could be, and got back to my seat and opened it up. You are hereby assigned to pilot training. And that was, that was what I was after. But you could have been bombardier or navigator. And anyway, then immediately the next day we were transferred to another place. It was still at Santa Ana, and there we started training. Real training, every kind of training. And then we started flying. So the first plane there was the Stearman, great airplane. I loved it. And I started out in Eagle Field in California. And we were divided into squadrons and flights. And you never know what's going on around you. They don't tell you, they tell each other. But anyway, I had the idea, it was kind of difficult, and I had the idea I was about to flunk out. But one day, my trainer, Woodhead was his name. They were civilian trainers in the first phase at Eagle Field. Well, we were flying together, and he said, set it down over here. And so I landed and took him over to the corner, and he got out. I thought, what's he abandoned me for? And he said, okay, you take it up. And that was a surprise. That was completely a surprise, because I thought I'd be the last one to solo, and I was the first one to solo. And he said, you're ready, take it up to yourself. And I really thought he was trying to get rid of me, trying to kill me. He figured I would kill myself. He didn't want to get killed with me. But anyway, I remember saying, I'll show him that I can fly. Because I had the idea that he didn't think I was ready. But anyway, I took it out and flew, and I just loved it. That was the first time I'd been alone, flying solo. It was great. And I did maneuvers and aerobatics and all kinds of stuff. And then I came back, and he said, okay, that's fine. And from then on, I didn't fly with him. Well, when he wanted to teach us new things, he flew with us. But otherwise, you just practice what he'd already taught you. And so we had a lot of time on our own. Those Stearman do not have an automatic starter on them, You have to get the side of the engine and wind this crank, get it going fast, and take it out, pull the thing, and it starts, generally. Anyway, when you weren't on duty to fly, you were on duty to crank out and get the other guys flying. And we had a lot of experiences. Some were good, and some pilots were good, and some were kind of poor. And that's what they wanted to find out. They didn't want to wait until you got in the war to find out whether you were good or not. The pilots who were in the war were good. They were the best we had. You'd fly sometime with your instructor and he'd teach you new things. We were doing aerobatics the first week. And some of them couldn't take it. Some of them made them sick every time. And they said, we can't have a person flying there with a Messerschmitt on him and get sick and have to heave all over the cockpit. But anyway, that was the routine. And then we went from there to Gardner Field, also California, and that was for basic training. And you got a new plane. You flew the BT-13. It was much more power, more instruments, more things to learn, and they taught us formation flying and night flying and things like that. And it was a different kind of airplane. And it had a canopy on it, so you didn't get your head blown off every time you flew. Oh, I liked it. They said a lot of bad things about it, but I liked it. But we didn't know we hadn't flown anything better, so we really enjoyed it. But there we had all military pilots, military instructors. Mine, I thought, was a little lazy. He didn't fly with me very often. He said, "You're doing fine. You get up and practice what I've taught you." And he'd go to I don't know where he'd go. But anyway, after that, we were transferred to Luke Field, Arizona for advanced. And then we flew the AT-6, Advanced Trainer number 6. And that was a beautiful airplane. I liked it. In fact, I flew a lot. And you go back over the same things again, how to land it, how to take off in it, how to find a place to land if you have an engine failure. It was nice because it had a constant speed prop. That's like an automatic transmission, in a car. Anyway, it had a lot of improvements. It was in fact, some of our other countries that we traded with, we sold them the AT-6 as a fighter. They used it. It had a .30 caliber gun mounted on the cowl. But before, it was just all new. It was exciting. That was really exciting. It was a faster plane, more powerful. We would have an instrument course that to teach you to use the instruments, and you'd go in and go under a hood. They put a hood over it so you couldn't see outside anyway. And so you just concentrate on the instruments, and you do all kinds of different maneuvers. You had to learn how to follow the instruments. Now, a person who hasn't flown won't know it, but you have several different attitudes of the airplane that are the same. I mean, the attitudes are different, but the sensation on your body is the same. For example, if you do a tight turn and pull it in pretty tight, the sensation on your body is the same as if you were going straight down and up. And so you can't distinguish by sight because you can't see anything. And so you have to learn to depend on instruments, and that's pretty hard to do. I mean, to feel like you're going this way in your seat, and instruments tell you you're going the other way, or you're going straight. But you have to believe the instrument. It's telling you. We had a lot of instrument time. Everything doesn't go the way you want it to in the service. They do it their way, not yours. You just do what you're told. But the graduating at Luke Field was kind of fun. Luke Field, you had your gunnery training too. You went down to Gila Bend for that, and you had low-level formation flying. That was kind of touchy. You had high-level flying, above 20,000 feet, and whatever we hadn't had before, we got that at Luke. This was the climax in a way. When you graduated, you got your wings, you got your license to fly, and the biggest thing is all the pressure was off of you. I mean, not all of it, but that officers always chewing you out for doing something wrong, or whether you did it wrong or not. And now they treat you like a gentleman, sir. You were a sir now. They didn't call you hey you or any worse names than that. They showed you respect, and you bought your first uniform, then they would provide it after that. That's what we graduated in. That's the point that I expected to get transferred to a base where we were training in P-51s. Didn't happen. In fact, most of our class did not even get flying assignments because there were too many of them. We'd caught up with the demand, and so there were some glider pilots chosen. Some didn't get any flying assignment at the time.
Prior to becoming an instructor on the AT-6, D. Lamar Jensen flew P-40s out of Randolph Field, a base near San Antonio, Texas.
The AT-6, you trained in. The P-40, you don't train. You're all by yourself starting. There's no time when you solo. You solo the first time. So you give it a lot of cockpit time. You memorize that cockpit so you know where everything is. Not by sight, but by field. You know, the P-40, you have to remember how you taxi. You taxi like this. You're trying to go there, but that's just how you get there. And why is that? It's not just to waste time and use gas. It's because the P-40 has a big nose out in front, and it's a tricycle. It's not a tricycle here. The tail is down, and so this is out in front of you all the time. So you have to taxi that way. We had a lot of pre-flight training in the P-40 before then they say, okay, you take it. So you're on your own then, and from the first flight. I can remember one thing, the feel of power, pushing that throttle forward, a much faster takeoff than the AT-6 did. I was on a high altitude flight, and of course above 10,000 you have to use oxygen. It's a rule whether you need it or not. And so I was on oxygen and flying, and the engine conked out on me. And my first reaction, what was the first reaction? What do you think your first reaction would be? Hit the silk. You got a parachute on you. You've had a lot of parachute training. It's the most common thing. And so I just automatically cranked back the canopy, and that changed my mind. Hit that air at 300 miles an hour, and I know there must be a better way. I'm very high. I'm close to 30,000 feet, and I've ever since I got in the Air Force, I've been picking the landing fields because the instructor always had you do that. He'd pull the throttle, and so you had practice. I had practice finding proper fields. You want something that's hard if you can find it, not soft, and not with tall wheat on it or something. But anyway, so my first thought after that, wasn't my first thought, but my first thought after I decided not to bail out was to find a landing spot, forced landing. And so I looked around, and I was very high. The P-40s sink awfully fast, though, when without an engine. And so I spotted Randolph Field, where it's stationed, and I said, I can make that. And so the next step was to call the tower, call the field, and tell them what happened, and get them to clear it, and keep other planes out. And so I just flew it back to Randolph, which was on the horizon. It had, when I was there, 2 cement runways, one down each side. I think they were going east and west. and then outside of that was a grass mat. And usually your AT-6s used the grass mat, and we on the two sides of Randolph Field, kind of keep separated. One was for single engine fighters, and the other was for twin engine. And they were flying a UC-Doocy, and they had their cement runway there that they used. But outside of the cement runway was grass, and that's where the P-40s, where the AT-6s landed. And they told me to land there and don't worry about the cement. So I came in and landed on the grass. It was fine. I got out. What did you think they would do? Give you a rest or something? I got out of the plane, and immediately they assigned me another P-40. They don't want you to get spooked by the plane. That's what they told me later. And so they assigned me another plane and sent me right back up. And I went up to find a squadron of planes and to fly formation with them. I discovered, I don't think anybody ever told me, that it was easier to fly formation the more power you had, the more speed you had. You see some of these fighters flying over, and you think, how do they do that? That's much easier to fly formation in that than it is in a Stearman, because they're bouncing around so much. These are so high powered that they cut through the air. They don't bounce around with it. They make their own trail, and so then you make your trail alongside. You can get up closer, and we flew formation a lot. You have to. You realize in the war, every place you went, you flew formation. You hardly went. A single airplane didn't go out very much on its own. You went in a group, and you flew in a group. You flew in a formation. You don't want to lose anybody, and so we had a lot of formation flying. And so then I got an assignment to go back to Luke Field as an instructor in the AT-6. They tried to make me believe that was an honor. That was the next desirable thing to a fighter assignment. And I guess it was, I don't know. The biggest change is you changed cockpits, and the instructor was in the back cockpit, and so you had to change because the point of view was a little different in the landing and everything, but anyway. And you soon got the feeling of a responsibility, because you were the responsible one now. There was nobody there to with any more rank or any more experience than you had. And besides, I had a student, one student named Lindbergh. He was funny. But anyway, you always have accidents. One of them was supposed to be an observer, of course. All he had to do was keep his eyes open and keep them moving. Because that's one of the things you have to be aware of. There are other airplanes in the sky too, a lot of them. You had to always be aware of that. Well, I don't know what happened in this case. There were two instrument planes. They were both flying instruments. So the one guy was under cover. He couldn't see anything. And then the observer. And something went wrong, and they ran into each other. Killed all four. And boy, were they mad at everybody. This is not fun. And they had us out in the hangar at attention while they went around the circle asking us questions. Questions of things that we should have known for flying, everything about flying. And any time somebody missed a question, they make a mark. None of the people who missed any questions got second lieutenants when they graduated. They graduated, but they were made warrant officers. It wasn't the same thing. Anyway, we learned our lesson. We were all very, very careful after that. And I had a few funny things happen once. I think I had 4 students. We were formation flying. And when we got through, I was kind of tired, and we got through. I was leading the group, and I peeled off, and they were each to follow at certain second intervals. And I peeled off like that, and pulled up and noticed the next guy came off and kept going down. And finally he came out too, because if you leave the controls alone, they'll neutralize for you. You don't need to do anything with them. And he came down and did a beautiful turn. And when he came out of it, after he came out of it, I called him on the radio and said, "What happened?" And he says, "We took off so fast, and that's a hurry. I forgot to fasten my seatbelt. And so when he peeled off, he fell out of the seat up against the canopy. Fortunately, the canopy was closed. And he couldn't reach the rudder. He couldn't reach anything. And so the plane just pulled itself out. So that was kind of a strange, exciting adventure. But I know that never happened to him again. And the other adventure was night flying, and we had a group of guys that were teaching and practicing night flying. You fly around, and land, and you take off, fly around again, and land. And it was getting kind of late, and I was kind of tired. And so I don't know what happened, but I suddenly was aware. I looked up, and there was the runway was way out in front of us. We were going to hit long before we got to the runway, and I guess my mind, I wasn't concentrating, and suddenly I was conscious of the runway, and it was way out in front of us, and we were about to hit. And I just grabbed the controls, shoved the throttle on, and we landed. And so I worked with him for another hour at least, practicing the judgment. Because he wasn't aware that he was not to the runway yet. So I made sure that he knew when he was at the runway and when he wasn't. So then we just flew for another hour or so, doing the same thing, landing, letting him land. And those are two incidents that I recall. I suppose altogether I got 600-700 hours in the 86, and maybe 100 hours in the P-40. I had a good friend, Jack Howard, and I think he was the cause of wanting to leave that. I was pretty satisfied with the instructor work, but we were still the strange kids. We still wanted to get overseas. That was the first. You'd use a lawnmower if you needed to get overseas. I don't know why that was so. I've been overseas so many times now, I'm not impressed with it. But anyway, then I really was. A bulletin came out, or an order or something, that they wanted pilots. They wanted pilots to train as B-29 flight engineers. They wanted 3 pilots aboard, not just 2. 3 trained pilots, just in case. And that's the basic unit. You normally had 10 people in a B-29, but you can fly it with 3. Pilot, co-pilot, and a flight engineer. But what the order was, see, this is, the war had been going on now. I think it was, we were suspecting that it was going to end, and so if we were going to do anything, we would do it fast. And so this order came through for B-29 flight engineers to train for flight engineering. They wanted pilots if possible. And I think they sort of geared it because they knew they were running out of need for fighter pilots. I enjoyed the B-29. Of course, you realize I had to fly backwards. The flight engineer flew backwards on a B-29. You didn't have any controls. You had throttles, mixture controls, prop setting, and all the engine instruments for the plane. So the flight engineer's job was to keep the plane flying. He was in charge of the plane when we were flying. He didn't fly it, but he was the one that was in charge of making sure everything worked right. Because the pilot's not looking at that. He's just looking at the sky and where he's going. The B-29, get this, was air conditioned. The places where the crew were air conditioned. The bomb bay wasn't, but it had a tunnel that went back there that was air conditioned too. You could just crawl back there if you wanted to go back to the midsection or rear. Nobody had ever heard of an air-conditioned airplane before, but the B-29 was. We flew the B-29 all over the country. I got assigned to the overseas unit at Smoky Hill Army Air Base in Salina, Kansas. And then I got an interesting experience, an interesting thing. We were without play. You know, we shut down when the war ended in Europe. There was not nearly enough flying to get your flight time even. So my roommate and I, a flight of B-26s landed. We were at Kirtland, it's still at the Kirtland Field. Flight of B-26 came, and we both looked at each other and said, let's go. We were thinking the same thing. Let's see if they had any space and could use another pilot. So we ran over to the operations, and yes, there were 2 co-pilot spots on these B-26s. I'd never flown a B-26 before. But anyway, they signed us on. But once you get on, you sign the log, it's all automatic. You don't have to apply for flight pay after that. You get flight pay if you're flying co-pilot in a B-26. Nobody cares. So that was to get flight time. That's why we did it. And they were taking those B-26s to storage for pickling, we called it, in Victorville, California, the pickling center, where we put them and left them there. Out of the clear blue, we got orders at Kirtland Field to ready, I think they said 30 airplanes, B-29s. They had an assignment, and I was on the assignment list. They sent us to California to pick up new B-29s that were being made in Seattle, shipped down. These were in Northern California. And they wanted them ferried down to Southern California where they would be pickled for future use. And I was on that assignment. There was about 30 planes, 30 crews who had the assignment. And we worked for about a month, flying every day. We'd fly a B-29 down, and we'd fly down to Victorville and leave them. And then the C-47s and C-46s would pick us up and take us back up to where we got the plane. Now that took all day because we went much faster than they did. So that is, we'd take off, we'd fly down there, and then we'd wait. We'd just wait all day till all the transport planes arrived to take us back. And it was dark when we got back. Then we went to bed. And the next morning we would take off again with another airplane. We had a daily flight of B-29s that we took down to Victorville. My co-pilot and I said, let's get out of here and let's have a Christmas dinner. That sounds like a good idea. And so we were in the hangar, and so we walked up to the BOQ and ordered a beautiful Christmas dinner. We had it all. When we got through eating, we started walking back to the line, and where people were waiting, and a couple of MPs stopped us. And they came up to us and said, "You're out of uniform, aren't you, sirs?" Yeah, we're out of uniform for where we are. We're on base, but it's the only thing we have. We have our flying outfit, and that's what we flew in, and that's what we're going to fly back in. We never changed them. And he said, "Well, that's a little out of uniform. You're supposed to have Class A or Class B uniform on any place on the base." So he took us to the provost marshal, and he locked us up so he could keep track of us. And we spent the rest of the day behind bars in Victorville till they notified us that the last of the transport planes had arrived and we could go back to the flight line and fly back. So that's how I spent that Christmas.
After World War II ended, D. Lamar Jensen pursued flying as a civilian. He purchased a surplus Fairchild PT-19 and also ended up flying a Piper Cub as an agricultural pilot.
Well, my brother went with me out to Kansas because we hadn't seen each other for 5 years. So he was just going to stay with me until I left, and then he'd go home. We'd take my car home. And so, but we got talking and talked, and finally decided, we should do something in the flying business. Because, well, I was a licensed pilot, had a commercial license, and my brother is a great mechanic, been a mechanic all his life. And so we thought if he would get his A&E license, airframe and power plant training, we could be independent, for a while, as long as we weren't too successful, in giving lessons, giving trips. Two problems. First of all, I was still in the service, and we didn't have an airplane. Solving that was our problem. So I just got a brainstorm idea. I wrote to the War Department, Washington, D.C. Whoever thought of doing that? But I wrote and told them my situation, that I was, my primary MOS was 1054 or something like that, single engine fighter. And now for some time I had been four engine engineer. I'd like to transfer back to single engine fighter. And can you believe I got an answer within 2 weeks okaying the request? See, they didn't need fighter pilots anymore. So they immediately assigned me as a fighter pilot and told me I could get out. Within 2 weeks I was out, got out at Denver. But the other thing we needed is an airplane. And we heard that they were selling surplus military planes, primary trainers, because they had so many of them. Ponca City, Oklahoma. So we got in the car and drove down there to see it. I had no idea there was going to be so many planes. There were hundreds of planes. So we looked them over, and remember, my brother is a mechanic, and he'd check the engines, and I took a couple of them up, not at the same time, but for test flight to see how they flew, and found one, a Fairchild PT-19. I got in and flew it, and it flew quite well. I liked it. And so we made the decision right there that we would try to buy it. It cost $1,900. And we called our folks to see if they had any handy cash. Dad sent the money, and we took what we had and paid him the $1,900, had an airplane on our hands. I also went to the airlines. I think it was Lockheed. I don't remember for sure. And to see about airline flying. And they just kind of laughed at me. Can you imagine how many 4-engine pilots there were now running loose? And they had plenty of pilots. They didn't need any. What I was going to do now was become a designer, an airplane designer. But you know, anything to do with that, anything to do with science, yeah, the basic thing is math. Math. And I hated math, and I was not good in it. So we went back to our original idea. I got home, and we had some work we needed to do on my plane. We had it at the Twin Falls Airport. It was like a cub. And there I met the son of the patriarch, stake patriarch, who had given me my patriarchal blessing before I went into service. And I met him at the airport in Twin Falls, and we got he's quite an entrepreneur. He had gotten in touch with an organization of crop dusters in Plentywood, Montana. So he said, what I need is transportation. I want to go see what it looks like. So I said, okay, and I took him. He got in my plane, and we flew to Plentywood, Montana, and talked to the people and watched their operation, and it was great. And so he decided to buy in with it. They kept their airplanes, and he leased them. They had 10 planes for crop dusting. And so he leased them. I dusted crops. I had talked him into flying for him, being a crop duster. And then what he talked me into was being a ferry pilot, ferry the planes from Plentywood, Montana to Twin Falls, Idaho. We dusted for pea weevil. The only thing they would get him was dust. DDT, actually. That's before it was outlawed. But that's what they used. The first day of dusting, I took the plane out and dusted a field and went back to the airport and learned that Benny, that was the friend that came down from Plentywood to help us out, show us how to crop dust, had been killed. I was out dusting, and they had another field that needed dusting. So he said, oh, I'll do it. Now remember, their dusting was very different in Montana than it was in Magic Valley, Idaho. In Montana, they dusted when the crop was younger, and they just took off at the same field that they dusted. And they were big fields, and there wasn't a tree in sight or any other obstacle. And they just dust, never get more than 10 feet in the air. Well, they would when they get to the end of the line, and would go up for wing over to come back. And so that's the experience they'd had, and that's all he'd had. And he came over to help me dust, and he got a field that was kind of narrow, but up and down, and went downhill. And he started at the top, dusted down the line. The safer way would have been to go crosswise, but look, that's a narrow field, and you're turning on and off your dust all the time. But so it made some sense. He flew it one run down, made his turn back, came back. But remember, it's kind of steep. So he was losing power all the way back up this time, losing airspeed. When he got to the end, he pulled up to make his turn and stalled out, crashed in a big new canal they were building, concrete canal, and was killed. First day of our dusting. And I could hardly believe it, but it happened. And my folks, of course, wanted me to get out of the business, but I still hadn't. I don't know if I got my first check or not, but it was much better pay than I could get anything place else. So I wanted to keep doing it, and did for the whole season. And then I got called on a mission, and I accepted the call. So I left the plane there under my brother's care while I went on my mission. And I was in Guatemala City, and one of our investigators was a pilot and was a member of military, Guatemalan military. And do you know that their first-line fighter was a AT-6? They had a 30 caliber gun mounted on top. And anyway, I said, hey, if you ever get a chance, I flew that hundreds of hours. I'd like to fly with you. I didn't think he'd ever do anything about it, but he did. He went and checked his CO. And in a couple of weeks, he said, you're okay. They want you to fly with us. Are you kidding? No. And so they checked me out at AT-6. And I went up, and he went up, and we flew around. And I don't know what we did. We flew the AT-6 and came back and landed. But while we were flying, they had a revolution. They have revolutions quite often in Guatemala. And I got back and quickly went back to my room and lay low because I didn't want them to know that I didn't want anybody to know that I was out flying with the Guatemalan Air Force the day of the revolution. I'd have been in trouble, I'm sure. So I sneaked out of that one. In a sense, I got disillusioned with flying kind of fast after the war ended. Now I realized I had really wanted to fight in the war. I wanted to help defend America. You may not realize how everybody felt that way. It was the country was more united then than it is now, and they all wanted to. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, America was up in arms and wanted to fight right now. We wanted to keep fighting until it was over.
After his pilot career, D. Lamar Jensen received his PhD from Columbia University and taught college history for over 35 years at Brigham Young University. He had 5 children with his wife, Mary White, to whom he was married for 64 years until her passing. He picked up painting later in life and authored several historical publications. Thank you for watching. Please check out our other episodes.